Okay, hi, and welcome to a warm welcome to Professor Amie Thomasson's third and final lecture in this series. And the talk of the day is named Redirecting Metaphysics. And after her talk, there will be a Q&A and something else that remains to be seen. Okay, so the floor is all yours.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks again so much for having me here for these lectures, and thanks to you all for persevering and coming back. So today I promise to give you something of a more positive proposal, a more positive ending to the lecture. So where we've been so far, just as a reminder, right? Over the last 2 days, I've talked about two central and prominent conceptions of metaphysics that have really been, have come to the fore since the 1950s or so. They're certainly not the only ways of doing metaphysics. I'm not saying every metaphysician does them, but they've played a central role. The explanatory conception that I talked about on Wednesday and the truth-maker conception that I talked about yesterday. And I've argued that both of these ways of looking at metaphysics kind of fail to notice the functional pluralism of language. And I've talked about why that matters. Then I've tried to do some work yesterday in explaining how we can identify different linguistic functions to make good on this talk of functional pluralism, and I'll make it more precise, using some work in systemic functional linguistics. And I suggested how doing so may enable us to unravel some old philosophical problems. Yesterday I talked about modality. I mentioned properties and numbers a little more briefly on the first day. Today, we get the positive suggestion. Right, so if those aren't great directions to take metaphysics in, if they encounter problems, then what should we do with metaphysics, as I said was my central question at the beginning? I'll give a suggestion for how we should redirect metaphysics and come to re-understand metaphysics. And maybe it won't surprise you by this stage to hear that the functional pluralist idea is going to play a central role here too. I think appreciating functional pluralism and taking a functional approach is also going to enable us to develop a more interesting and defensible alternative view of what to do with metaphysics. Okay, but you might ask, well, why does metaphysics need a new direction before I go about redirecting it? I have talked about, as I said, two prominent conceptions of metaphysics, the explanatory conception and the truth-maker one, and said they lead us into trouble. But you might say, well, forget about those. Those are relatively recent developments. Can we just return to a more sort of neutral, classic conception of metaphysics? Okay, well, then the question arises, what do you mean by metaphysics there? Classically, metaphysics is presented as investigating, making discoveries about, making claims about the world, right? What exists, what's fundamental, what the natures of various kinds of things are, etc., right? So we get claims about whether minds exist, what their relations are to bodies, for example, what a person is, what are the fundamental kinds of entities, and so on. And generally those contemporary metaphysicians who kind of don't like the deflationary work I do will repeatedly insist, no, metaphysics is about the world, right? Not about language or concepts. But if you think of metaphysics as engaged in trying to find out deep truths about what exists, about the natures of various kinds of things, about what the world is like, you encounter a very old and familiar problem that has, in recent literature, probably been most famously articulated by Stephen Hawking in his book with Leonard Mlodinow. And of course, this got a lot of press. Some people might remember when this came out. There are lots of outraged philosophers, right? Hawking says, people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And of course, this isn't a new problem with Hawking. I mean, philosophers have been aware of it ever since the natural sciences started to sort of peel themselves off from philosophy considered as a general love of wisdom, which probably started in maybe the 17th century around then, right? And this problem has recurred again and again for philosophers. So Hawking's just giving voice to a problem that we've known was out there for a long time. But what should we do about it? Another problem related to this is that it seems like if metaphysics is caught in a rivalry with the sciences, in a claim to be able to tell us what exists, what the world is like, what's fundamental, seems like a rivalry that metaphysics is bound to lose. The results of science, of course, have tended over the long term to converge, right? We think of them as largely converging on the truth, at least in the sort of central kinds of questions, what Simon Blackburn calls the sort of coastal waters of science, right? There's nothing like those kinds of credentials for metaphysics. In fact, on the contrary, the longer metaphysics goes on, the more the options seem to proliferate and diverge. You get more and more on the table. Here's a way of quantifying it for what it's worth. Some of you might remember or have participated in the Phil survey. I think there's a new version that's going on or has gone on recently. Anyway, the original one was in 2009. There were over 3,000 philosophers, professional philosophers, grad students, and so on, surveyed on 30 central questions like free will, yes or no, right? Does God exist, etc., right? And they tallied the results. The philosopher Brian Francis did a sort of statistical analysis of these answers and has a paper arguing that given the way that the answers are distributed, at least if we assume as he does, that there's a right answer to each question, even if we don't know what it is, he said the calculation tells us that the average philosopher gets about 47% to 67% right. All right, not very impressive, right? Given this proliferation, we probably hope for more accuracy from our medical professionals. On this basis, Francis suggests what we ought to do is just suspend judgment on all these core philosophical issues. Maybe go do something more useful, right? So the outcome of this analysis for Francis is, look, this gives us reason to think we can never know anything about these topics, never know which is the right answer. And so it seems to lead us into a kind of skeptical torpor, right? We should just stop trying to do anything on these issues. There's also this familiar problem that I've been mentioning over the last couple of days, that the epistemology of metaphysics is sort of eternally mysterious, right? We have some idea, at least, about the role of empirical work in making empirical scientific claims. Metaphysics claims to be distinct, doing work that's, in Ted Sider's phrase, epistemically metaphysical. But then, how is philosophy supposed to come to discover these things? What exists, what's fundamental, and what the natures are of things of various kinds? Again, there have been suggestions, some of which we've reviewed, that we could do it by appeal to the theoretic virtues. We talked about problems with that. We saw the problems with getting sort of too many options in answer to the question, what are the fundamental truth makers? Because you can restate them in so many different ways. So the question remains, right? How can we weigh up competing metaphysical theories to tell which one is right? So those are three sort of big problems facing a traditional view of metaphysics. Rivalry with science, failures of convergence, and epistemological mystery, where the last two might give you extra reason to think, if there really is a rivalry, you know, philosophy doesn't really have the upper hand in this. Now, there is a way to reconceive philosophy, I think, or at least parts of philosophy, right? You can put it this way. You can say, wait, think of philosophy not as asking questions about how the world is, about what exists and what it's like, what the world is like, but rather as doing normative work. Asking questions like, what ought we to do? How ought we to live? How ought we to reason? How ought we to update our beliefs, right? And in that way, you can take back into the fold, you know, large chunks of, certainly all of ethics, right? And of course, this is the easiest sell if you're trying to convince the dean or somebody that philosophy deserves to stay in business. You can, even the most diehard lover of science typically doesn't think that the natural sciences alone can answer these ethical questions, ought questions. How ought we to live? What ought we to do? What ought we to do with the technology we can develop? What ought we to use? By the second line, right, we can also reclaim bits, or maybe just claim, of logic, right? How ought we to reason to preserve truth? Epistemology, how ought we to update our beliefs in conditions perhaps of uncertainty, and so on. So by taking a kind of normative route, I think it's easy to rescue some bits of philosophy from the threat of rivalry with science. And notice the kinds of questions that Hawking doesn't ask, right? When he's saying that philosophy is dead and has been overtaken. He asks things like, how did this all get here? What's the world like? But not, what should we do? How should we live? What kind of government should we live under, right? How ought we to treat each other? Those don't appear. Okay, so we can get at least some of philosophy back that way, but you might think it's a little harder to save metaphysics this way, given its standard self-conception as doing work and trying to figure out what the world is like and what exists. So what can be said for metaphysics in the face of these kinds of worries? This is all a kind of motivation, then, for rethinking metaphysics. There is, of course, a time-honored answer to this, one that we've talked about a little bit in the Q&A, right, that was really popular, you know, about a century ago, in the first half of the 20th century. There was widespread suspicion of metaphysics, and we had this sort of alternative answer that metaphysics, or sometimes it was put as philosophy generally, can be concerned with analyzing our language or our concepts, right, depending on who you turn to. You can see this kind of answer to the question of what metaphysics can do in philosophers otherwise as diverse as Husserl, Ayer, Wittgenstein, Ryle, Strawson, Austin, right? So there's a great tradition then of trying to rethink what we can do in conceptualist or linguistic terms. All right, what happened? Well, this view, of course, as you all will know, hit a severe backlash, right? What happened? Well, first there were doubts raised about whether there really are analytic truths, or if we can understand truths about meaning that in ways that will enable us to do conceptual analysis at all, right? And here I include Quine's doubts about analyticity, Kripke's theory of reference, right, and so on, that made many philosophers think that meanings just aren't things that are sort of in the head and analyzable in the way that was thought to be possible by ordinary language philosophers. I've responded to some of those doubts elsewhere. I won't really talk about them today. I can point you to references if you want. There's also, I think, been a backlash against this view due to just a kind of disappointment with this limited conception of philosophy, right? So a lot of metaphysicians of my generation will say, really, is that all we can do? Right? Analyzing language or concepts, I don't care about that. That seems just superficial or local, merely parochial, unimportant, uninteresting, right? So Ted Sider famously says, who would prefer exploring our perhaps parochial conceptual scheme to exploring the fundamental features of reality, right? So there's a kind of drive to get back to a worldly conception of metaphysics. And I think this has prompted a lot of the sympathy for the revival of metaphysics, often on an explanatory or truth-maker model that then tries to see it as either part of the scientific enterprise or just like it on the explanatory model, or on the truth-maker model as sort of analogous in looking for explanations, but now bottom-up sort of truth-maker explanations rather than causal explanations, which are supposed to be analogous, at least. They're distinct. All right, so we seem to be stuck in a dilemma. Right? If you think of metaphysics on the old model as involving a sort of discovery of what exists and what the world is like, looks like you're stuck with a rivalry with science, with epistemological mysteries, and with a kind of skepticism that can result from the kind of divergences that came up in the Phil survey. But if you think of metaphysics as investigating our language or concepts, at least the accusation is, that just makes it trivial, superficial, uninteresting. So what can we do? Well, what I want to suggest is that we reconceive metaphysics, yes, as linguistic or conceptual work. So this is a suggestion that has much more to do with the second option than the first, right? But rethought and more broadly reconstrued. Broadly reconstrued as conceptual engineering, again, broadly construed. I'll talk about what I mean by that broad construal as we go along. So what's involved in the broad construal? Well, here's the first thing, right? Some people here talk about conceptual engineering, and they're prone to think of it on the model of like a mechanical engineer sitting down at her desk and designing a blueprint for a new machine from the ground up, right? Okay, that's one thing engineers do. It's not the only thing engineers do, right? Engineers also are engaged in reverse engineering, right? So it's the engineers who go in after a hurricane or an earthquake to figure out how the building is and if it can still stand or if it needs to be knocked down and if we need some important structural repairs to it, right? It's software engineers who go in if you have malware attack your computer to try to figure out what this malware does, how it works, what it does to your computer in order to be able to remove it and recover your data, right? Other engineers will go in if you have a large piece of machinery that's broken to figure out how it works and what we can do with it. I think similarly in conceptual engineering, we need to make a really central part of this the project of reverse conceptual engineering. And that's going to cover a lot of what was done under traditional conceptual analysis. But it's also going to be broader, at least than many people thought of conceptual analysis as. Not necessarily broader than everybody who did it. Right? First of all, I want to back it up to explicitly include a kind of functional analysis. Not just, right, so the parody of conceptual analysis is, oh, it involves looking for necessary and sufficient conditions, but now we know you can't get those, and it's really boring and hopeless, right? That's the sort of parody you get from the metaphysicians. Certainly it's not all that ordinary language philosophers ever did by a long shot. So let me make explicit that a part of the way I'm conceiving of this reverse engineering will begin with a kind of functional analysis, kind of like I've been presenting to you before. I mean, think of it this way, right? If you're going into conceptual engineering, the question is, should we make changes in our concepts or language? Should we get rid of any of them, to repair them, introduce new ones, right? But before you consider removing or repairing a piece of your car, or before, if you're a surgeon, you consider removing or repairing a part of the body, you better have an idea what it does first, right? So you know if you should remove it, repair it, or just leave it be. So we can begin our conceptual work by trying to understand what these different concepts do for us. And I've tried to draw out at least the beginnings of a method for doing that, building on the work of systemic functional linguistics. Right? This would be the sort of formal functional analysis that would ask questions like, okay, so you want to know how our modal terminology works, or our talk of necessities, or even possible worlds? Why do we need a modal system in language? What does it do for us? What couldn't we do if we lacked a modal system? How does it interact with the systems of mood and propositional form and so on? Why do we need grammatical enablements to form nominalizations or other crossings of grammatical categories? Right? They leave you with what the linguists call grammatical metaphors. What do those do for us? And those will give us some clues about where to look for understanding the functions of talk of possible worlds, talk of moral requirements, and so on. Then we can also, I think, engage in the kind of material functional analysis that Mathieu Queloz highlights in his book that asks sort of more specific questions. Okay, we can get the functions of nominalizations. Now, what does it do for us to have a nominalization of knows into knowledge, or of is just into justice, right? And how do these differ from each other? And all of that, I think, will be crucial, useful work before we think about what should we do with our concept of knowledge? What should we do with our concept of justice or person or any of the rest? Truth. Right? But of course, it's not just functional analysis that we need. I think we also need an analysis of meaning understood for me as rules of use that enable the terms to fulfill these functions, to see not just what the thing does, but how it does it. How does it work? What are the rules of use? And also, how is it connected to rules of use for other related concepts, right? And other sort of grammatical rules that entitle us to embedded in propositions and things like that. Again, similarly, right, before you do reverse engineering in a busy old city, you better not just assess the building you're looking at, but also how it's connected to the buildings surrounding it, and maybe to underground systems of plumbing or transportation or whatever, right? Assess those kinds of connections. So similarly, we want to assess the inferential connections that one concept has to a range of others. And that'll come closer to looking like what we think of in traditional conceptual analysis. Okay, but it's not just reverse engineering, which is sort of the descriptive side of the work, but also what you might call a kind of reparative and constructive conceptual engineering, right? Normative conceptual work that asks, okay, so now what should we do, right? What terms or concepts should we use, and how should we use them? So suppose you do your analysis and your reverse engineering, you find out what functions it serves, or it's supposed to serve. You can ask how well it's fulfilling those functions. You can ask if these are functions that we ought to retain, or are they in some way insidious or outdated or irrelevant. You also have to ask questions if you want to make changes about how these changes might affect the rest of the context. If we change our concept of responsibility, do we also have to change our concept of freedom? If we change that, do we have to change our concept of personhood or action, right? And so on. Do we have to, will they affect our range of goals and purposes that we have? And we can also ask if there's new purposes that we want to serve by introducing new or revised concepts. So we can do some sort of bottom-up, what Dave Chalmers calls de novo conceptual engineering as well. So note how this broadens the traditional model of conceptual analysis in a couple of ways. Right? So first, on the descriptive side, the reverse engineering side, right, I want to broaden it to explicitly include functional analysis. Right? I mean, again, you see this in the work of people like Ryle sometimes, right? But I want to make explicit this is to always be a part of the game, which has often not been done or noticed, as well as analysis of the rules that enable the concepts to fulfill those functions. But then it's also broadened beyond what most people think of as conceptual analysis, in going beyond descriptive conceptual work to include this normative conceptual work, right? Including reparative and constructive conceptual engineering. Now, to be honest, right, I think in the first side, right, the descriptive conceptual work, empirical work's going to come in there, right? In empirical linguistics, maybe also in empirical psychology, right? Think of things like Macheret's work on trying to understand concepts and how they work. So there may come to be, if not exactly a rivalry, a sort of working with sciences of linguistics and psychology in that first stage. Right, and I've sort of modeled some of that this week. The latter half, though, being explicitly normative, right, is going to be, I think, enduringly philosophical work that we can do better if we understand the descriptive side too. Okay, so why should we rethink metaphysics in this way, as conceptual engineering broadly construed? Well, first, it's going to avoid rivalry with science, again, at least in the second part, right, in the normative side, and it won't really exactly, hopefully, if it's done well, rival the sciences in the first part, but rather work hand in hand with linguistics and psychology and make use of them. Another kind of neat feature, right, is that the proliferation of views you get in metaphysics then, right, it's no longer embarrassing. If you don't think, oh, there's some right answer, but the philosophers are all over the place, so only 47 to 67% could be right. If instead you think, look, when we're trying to answer the question, what is a person, right, part of what we're doing here is trying to figure out how we should use our concept of person in some new circumstances or for some set of purposes. What you've got is rather kind of alternative proposals to address engineering problems, right? It's not a big problem if you've got a river and you need a new bridge over it, and you put the question to the engineers and they give you 16 different proposals, right? That's kind of nice. And maybe one of them might be better as a railway bridge and another one as a pedestrian bridge, or given one budget versus another budget, right? So they may be different proposals to address different purposes or different fine-grained purposes. Or it's entirely possible that you get two that are equally good. But it's also quite predictable that some will be better than others once you've got the purposes on the table. So it doesn't mean that they're all equally good, but it does mean that when we get a proliferation of views, including, you know, I think even some of this sort of deep metaphysical work about what's fundamental, until we say it's bundles of tropes or states of affairs or whatever, if you think of these as alternative conceptual proposals for how we can think about the world and how things are constructed, it might be of interest. Other virtues of rethinking of metaphysics in this way. Well, I'm going to try to make the case that this isn't a huge break from metaphysics as we know it, as we love it, as we put it in our anthologies and teach it to our students. Right? This retains a large continuity with a lot of what philosophy has always done well. And it also provides a response to the worry that thinking of the work of metaphysics in conceptual or linguistic terms makes it just shallow or uninteresting. On the contrary, I'll try to show you why, once we understand it as conceptual engineering, we can see why it's crucially important to human life. And so it gives a clear picture for us of what we can do and how we can do it and what kind of contribution metaphysics can make to human life without the epistemological mystery or the air of rivalry with science and so on. Okay, so first let me talk about how this view, metaphysics as conceptual engineering, though it might sound novel, can actually capture and retain a great deal of what metaphysics has always done and often done well. So take the reverse engineering side, right? In the functional work, we ask what functions has, does, and can the term serve. Again, this is something that has been done prominently in the history of philosophy, right? Sometimes forgotten. I've suggested a method of linguistic functional analysis this week, but you can see other approaches to functional analysis, right? In the work of Bernard Williams, of Craig, Fricker, Queloz, and Mathieu Queloz, again, does a really lovely job of kind of drawing out a historical tradition of pragmatic conceptual genealogy. There's also historical genealogy. So the difference between these, if I didn't say it before, the pragmatic genealogy asks these kind of counterfactual questions. What couldn't we do if we didn't have a concept of knowledge, for example, or justice, right? The historical genealogy question asks, how has this concept actually evolved, right? Usually by looking at texts and what's changed over time, right? And you can see work in that historical genealogical tradition, which can sometimes give us an idea of what needs the concept was answering to, or maybe what contingent historical facts pushed it in one direction rather than another, meaning that maybe we don't need to go there anymore, right? Or maybe there are purposes that we don't want to serve anymore. Anyway, there's of course prominent examples of work in historical genealogy. In Nietzsche, most famously, Foucault, Katerina Dutil-Nevaes does this for logical form and some other concepts, right? So that's been around. I think most of the familiar work in ordinary language philosophy would fall into the second category, right, as analytical work. And in fact, a lot of the work that just gets done in philosophy, right, if you go just to see papers or read the journals, right, is roughly this kind of work in trying to understand, they'll usually put it in object language terms, what art is, what freedom is, should we understand freedom as requiring an ability to do otherwise or not, and so on, or a lack of causation or not. Action, what action is and how it relates to freedom, intention, etc. What knowledge is, and also understanding their relationships, right? So does the concept of freedom entail a concept of responsibility? Does responsibility require freedom? Does freedom require intentionality, lack of determinism, etc. Right? So this is all really familiar work here. But then there's also sort of deeper global and transcendental conceptual work, right? Questions about roughly how must any conceptual scheme work if we're to be presented with a spatiotemporal world at all, or a world of other persons, or of cultural objects, right? I mean, Husserl does this beautifully. Kant, of course, famously does this kind of transcendental work. Strawson does this kind of work in trying to figure out what concepts are essential. Then there's also, even in the reverse engineering phase, once we understand how our concepts work and what functions they serve, we can do some therapeutic work, right, as Wittgenstein would have described it, untangling puzzles and paradoxes, right? And you can see this in Wittgenstein all over the place. You can see it in Ryle on the concept of mind, that once we properly understand, as he puts it, the logical geography of our mental concepts, right, then we can disentangle the problems of mind that arise from assuming that our mental terms must be referring to either a mental thing or a physical thing. So there's a lot of lovely historical therapeutic work too. And then here's another really big area where I think there's tons of interesting work being done these days by metaphysicians and others, what I call conceptual rectification. That is to say, we've inherited a certain conceptual scheme that's been developing over a long time that involves concepts like person and object and freedom and so on, time. And we've also at the same time been learning a ton scientifically. Right? A ton that makes us say, ooh, we thought that this was a solid object. Turns out there's mostly empty space there and teeny tiny particles zipping around. Ooh, what do we do with our concept of ordinary object? Can that be rectified? Or our concept of solidity? What do we do with our concept of time, now that physicists will think and speak in terms of space-time rather than anything like the kind of clock time or phenomenological time that we experience more naturally? What do we do with our concept of freedom? The more we learn, that inclines us to think that everything is determined. And the more we learn about the way and the timing with which our actions are initiated by neurological events and how that relates to when we think we've decided. Similarly, for a range of other concepts, what do we do with the concept of mind? Now that we tend not to think in terms of souls and a kind of Cartesian mind, but instead know more and more about neuroscience and about empirical psychology. What do we do with our concept of intelligence now that we have artificial intelligence, right? On and on and on. So there's all sorts of really cool and interesting rectification problems that we all know lots of philosophers who are working on this. Those remain as important as ever. So we got these different schemes. This, of course, is roughly the project of philosophy as Sellers described it, right? Of trying to see how we can reconcile the scientific and the manifest images. Right? Okay, there's also always been, I think, work done in philosophy broadly and metaphysics particularly that really should be best interpreted as normative conceptual work. So suppose you get a case where our old concepts can't be rectified with those we get in the developing sciences. What should we do with them? Should we separate them out as two different concepts? Should we just get rid of our old school concepts? Is there a way to build bridges between them? Right? I think many of the questions pursued in metaphysics and elsewhere in philosophy about what freedom is, what art is, what consciousness is, right, can really be best understood, as I'll come to in a minute, as questions about how we should understand these concepts, in what ways we should sort of precisify and make use of or maybe revise these kind of vague concepts from our ordinary life. How should we modify our concepts to apply in situations of new technology or new knowledge? We talked about new knowledge. You can also think about new technology, like we have an old concept of privacy, right? Roughly involved, don't peek in my windows, right? Now we need a new concept of privacy that we can use in trying to figure out what privacy regulations should govern the internet and our personal information on it, right? And then there's also questions like, this would be the de novo conceptual engineering. Can we introduce new concepts, or should we, for new purposes, whether they're epistemic purposes, philosophical purposes, technological or social? And here's some that are, fairly recent introductions, right? In the law, should we introduce concepts like sexual harassment? That just goes back to the 70s, right? It was introduced by some Cornell activists. Non-combatant, and working out issues in military ethics, right? In epistemology, the introduction of a concept of degree of belief, right? No part of our sort of ordinary way of talking. Husserl introduces the concept of noema, right? I don't know who introduced the concept of qualia, but it's clearly a philosophical introduction, and someone can tell me later exactly where it came from, right? So this happens in philosophy and in the law, in ethical issues, and in other kinds of work. So I mentioned a moment ago that, I think that questions like how should we understand freedom, human rights, art, and consciousness is a good way to interpret what a lot of old philosophical work has done anyway. So let me talk about that for a minute. I think that reconsidering, revising, and altering our conceptual scheme is something metaphysicians have always done. So this is not like a huge break. Often it's done implicitly, using what David Plunkett and Tim Sundell call metalinguistic negotiation. So metalinguistic negotiation is a pretty pervasive phenomenon. It involves using a key term as a way of pressing for views about how it should be used. Right? So you could see this, for example, in debates back in the wars of the 90s about whether waterboarding is torture, right? Where the disputants were really, is it not? It looked like a factual dispute. And yet what they were really pressing for was different views about how torture ought to be defined. Should we follow the US Department of Justice definition or the United Nations definition, roughly, right? You see this in sort of silly everyday debates, like about whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not, right? Or about whether a racehorse can be an athlete, yeah. But we also see it all over the place in philosophical debates. Here's how you can tell when people are metalinguistically negotiating rather than involved in a factual dispute. Some markers are, like, if there's really no difference in their factual beliefs. It's not that the disputants about torture have different beliefs about how waterboarding is done or what its effects are. Right? They can agree on all that and still disagree about whether waterboarding is torture. It's not resolved by seeing how the term is actually used, by one being able to point to a definition in the dictionary or in the UN Charter. They'll still continue the argument. Right? So these are all signs that what's at stake in the debate is really a normative question about how the term should be used, not a worldly question about what torture really is, so you can put it in those terms. And I think we can see this in a lot of classic philosophical debates. I've argued some of this elsewhere. Debates about personal identity, conditions for personal identity. This is virtually explicit in Locke, right, which as far as I know sort of started off a lot of the modern discussion, right? He's like, person is a forensic term used for assigning praise and blame. And it's for that reason that he thinks that even though people don't use person in a way that just tracks memories, continuity of memory, that we ought to use it in such a way. And he's explicitly pressing for a change in how we ought to identify and distinguish persons. Debates between hard and soft determinists are roughly debates about whether we should require a lack of determinism in order for freedom to apply, right? Is just doing what you want or doing what you want under certain further conditions enough to be free, or does it take a failure of causation? So debates between like Hume and Edwards, for example. Debates about what art is, right? Does art have to be mimetic or not? Does art have to be part of an art world? Those are all ways of renegotiating how we should use the concept of art. Consciousness, causation, run through your favorite debates, see if it works. It certainly works for many cases. So if that's what's been kind of implicitly going on in a lot of our debates anyway, I'd say better to make it explicit. Recognize that's what's really going on, and then we can put the reasons on the table. Why we ought to think of person in this way, for example, or art in this way, leaving them open for public examination instead of just pretending to make worldly discoveries about the nature of things in the way that a scientist might make worldly discoveries about the genes of a tiger. Right? Now, once we see it in this light, as work that involves renegotiating or re-engineering our concepts, including for metaphysics, I think many of those concepts most central to human life, object, causation, person, etc., we can see that this conceptual and linguistic work is not at all shallow, uninteresting, unimportant, right, as the metaphysical critics will put it. Because the concepts and language we use are central to how we investigate the world, how we treat other people and how we treat ourselves, and even how we reshape and reconstruct the social world. So it's worthwhile to think about them. Right? I'll talk through some examples of this in a second. Because it seems like the worst thing we could do is to just give up into a kind of Francis-style skeptical torpor that says, yeah, we'll go, build something out of wood instead because we can't make any progress here. Because how we think and talk really matters. And so it's worth taking time to try to do it well. So ways in which our concepts can shape the ways we investigate and treat disease and other problems, right? Think about the ways in which our changed theoretical concepts for space-time were needed in order to develop relativity at all. Think about the importance of developments in the concept of gene and species to the development of biology, and both of those have been through sort of huge transformations over the last 100 years or so. Also crucial, right, for other practical issues. Like in the US, you're not allowed to build if there's an endangered species on the land, right? But what counts as a distinctive endangered species versus just a variant of a non-endangered kind? You got to have a species concept to answer those questions. Think about the way our concepts for cognitive, emotional, and behavioral differences have evolved over the last few hundred years, right? From a religious model where they were likely to be thought of as possessed or something like that if they had severe enough problems, and then the treatment, you call in the priest, right? To a medical model, right, that introduces the concept of mental illness, right, and typically aims for a kind of medicalized treatment for them involving pharmaceuticals and so on, to this sort of social and environmental model, right, that's emerging for at least some kinds of emotional and behavioral differences that says, look, if we rearrange classrooms and the class time and so on, all the kids will be fine and be able to learn well without having to put them on medication. This is a problem with the organization of our classrooms, not necessarily a medical problem, right? So in each of these cases, the way we conceptualize these differences makes a huge difference to how we investigate it and how we treat it. And that makes a huge difference to people's lives. Think about the importance of our concepts in reshaping the social world, right? Social concepts aren't just a matter of like picking out some kind you can point to there. At least part of what goes on with our social concepts is they impose norms, right, for how people are to be treated, how we're to act. So think about pejoratives now, like pejoratives for certain races, national origins, or disabilities, right? These are problematic because they enjoin us to think of the people in that under that concept in a kind of dehumanizing or disrespectful way, right? They invite certain kinds of norms of treatment. Think about the ways in which our race, gender, and social category terms impose norms of action, how you're to behave if you get classified as a woman or a man or black or white or even a student or a professor, right? Think about our legal terms, right? And the way in which changes in the relevant inferential rules that no longer required two couples of so-called opposite sex in order to be married, right? You change that, you change the concept of marriage, but you automatically hook into something like 3,000 different legal rights that are tied to being married and responsibilities. That's the number in the US. I don't know how it is here. Right. And again, that changes people's lives, a new concept of marriage. Think about the way in which we can introduce new terms that make certain patterns of behavior identifiable readily and readily prosecutable and criticizable, right? Like terms like sexual harassment, hostile environment, genocidal rape, and so on. So in all these cases, the concepts we use matter hugely to how we live and what we do. So evaluating and changing our conceptual scheme is not superficial or trivial. It's crucial to human life, to scientific and social change, to how we run our lives, our investigations, and our bureaucracies. Now, as I've mentioned, this happens all over the place. You probably haven't thought about sexual harassment as a central metaphysical issue exactly, right? So it happens for all of our applied legal concepts and so on too. What's distinctive about metaphysics? I think just that it tends to focus on those concepts that have been really central to human life rather than applied legal concepts. Concepts like mind, object, freedom, causation, and so on. Truth, knowledge. Okay, so reconceiving metaphysics as conceptual engineering. That brings us some benefits. We don't have a rivalry with science. Proliferation of views is no longer an embarrassment. And it avoids epistemological obscurity and brings methodological clarity. Or does it? So the claim to avoid epistemological obscurity and bring methodological clarity is roughly this, right? We no longer have this image that we have to somehow do epistemically metaphysical work that involves peering into the world and discovering the fundamental objects and their nature and relations. Requires nothing more than conceptual work, right? Descriptive and normative, and sometimes empirical work too, to see if our concepts are fulfilled in the world, right? Or what how the borders are drawn. And yet, critics will say, conceptual engineering, sure, that's cool, that's fine, but it's not going to get you into an epistemologically better position. As Sider will say, it won't get you the epistemological high ground over traditional metaphysics. Because in order to do conceptual engineering well, you got to rely on metaphysics. Okay, so this is a really common response from the metaphysicians. Why? Well, look, here's the norms on how we should choose concepts or terms. Choose terms that refer, not really lousy ones like witch or phlogiston. Got to check the world, right? Choose terms for your sciences that are joint carving. Choose lithium, not lithium on Earth, but not on Mars, right, for example. Choose terms that reflect essences, and so on. But all that requires, they want to say, metaphysics. If not, if you don't want to do conceptual engineering metaphysically in ways that are responsive to the sort of metaphysical constraints of the world, they'll say, whatever you're doing in conceptual engineering, that's just going to give us arbitrary answers. You got no ground to stand on to make your proposal, make the claim that one proposal is better than another. It's just going to resolve into a power struggle. Whoever's got the most power will engineer the concept their way, and that's it. Right? So that's the threat that says, no, look, actually this doesn't improve our epistemological standing. And as Sider says, he thinks it's just implausible that the proposals would be arbitrary because he thinks it's just an objective matter, that some concepts are better than others, that lithium is better than lithium on Earth, and that fish and mammal are better than sea creature and land creature as concepts. These days, actually, if you've been following the literature, looks like we got to get rid of fish too and replace it with about 4 or 5 different concepts, according to the biologists. Fish as a concept turns out to be a bit of a mess. Apparently there's no concept of fish that will include all the things we think of as fish without including us. But that's a topic for another day and another speaker, I think. All right, so here's a reply to that line of worry. And this is where the functional approach comes in again. And this is another thing that kind of motivated me initially to ask myself the question, how can we identify linguistic functions? What can be said about these in a systematic and well-grounded way? So I think if we take a functional, not a metaphysical, approach to conceptual engineering, we can avoid this feeling of arbitrariness, this challenge that says, without metaphysics, it's just going to be arbitrary. Okay, how does that go? Well, we want to identify the functions to be served by the relevant concept or term, right? I've talked a little bit yesterday about how we can do that. Right? Not a finished project, but the start of one at least. Then we can evaluate proposals in conceptual engineering according to how well they serve their function. Right? they're succeeding or not. But we can notice that these functions may vary. Might vary a lot for property language versus for electron language versus for modal language and moral language and so on. And where the functions vary, the standards for what it takes to be a well-working concept, which concept we should choose, will vary too. So we can get a kind of pluralist approach to evaluating proposals in conceptual engineering that'll give different standards for accepting a range of modal concepts versus natural kind term concepts, something like that. But it's not arbitrary. In each case, we're evaluating it according to the function to be served. Just like you'd want different evaluative criteria for evaluating bridge designs versus nuclear power plants. Right? Okay, so let me give you a few examples of how we can do this non-arbitrarily using some of this work on function. So suppose you're evaluating concepts to serve in our chemical or biological theories. All right, what you want there, right, is terms that will enable you to make a lot of theoretic generalizations. This is straight up CARMAP, right? Enable you to make good explanations and predictions. And this is going to, of course, require empirical work to evaluate, right? We found out empirically that the concept of fish doesn't really do so great at enabling us to make generalizations about the fish, either about their heritage or about their features, right? But if that's the role of our chemical and biological concepts, it's easy to see why lithium's a better concept than lithium on Earth but not on Mars. And we don't have to appeal to some metaphysical structure of the world to get there. We can say, look, if you're doing chemistry, the geographic restriction here is not going to do anything for you. It's going to complicate the theory without enabling you to make any better predictions, right? And you can see why fish and mammal are better than swimming sea creature versus land creature. You can get more generalizations about their inner construction, about the way they reproduce and feed their young and so on, than just with sea creature versus land creature. And you still don't get enough with fish, so I'll have to divide that one again. And kind of runs to the fish example again quite nicely. So we can evaluate those choices non-arbitrarily, pragmatically. Now suppose instead we're evaluating language for properties, like the property of redness I've been talking about. Right? If you're thinking of it in conceptual engineering terms, the old debate about are there properties is really about should we eliminate property language, right? And most good nominalists would say, yeah, there's no properties, so we should eliminate property talk, right? These go together, unless you're going fictionalist or something. Okay, why, you ask the nominalist? Because it's more parsimonious to do without them? Oh, well then we have to ask, right? Are these properties really supposed to be sort of theoretical posits where parsimony is a relevant criterion? Or is property talk doing something else in our theories, as I talked about on Monday? If it's doing something else in our theories and they're not like theoretic posits where parsimony is a relevant constraint, that's not something we should worry about, right? Well, they might raise puzzles, and this will only be, of course, a pointer towards a couple of the many objections that have been raised. Look, properties are puzzling. How could one thing, say a universal of redness, be in two places at the same time, right? Or how could we come to know universals, right, if we can't be in perceptual contact with these abstract entities? Again, if you want to answer those questions, then we got to start with the functional evaluation. Note that introducing these nominalized property terms serves textual functions, and that these are super useful for forming generalizations, constructing laws, theories, and bureaucracies in all the ways I talked about on Monday. So we shouldn't give them up lightly. They're doing useful stuff for us. Right? Don't pull out the carburetor until you really know what's going on. You can also then, as part of your reverse engineering, notice the rules that introduce them, the kinds of trivial inferences that bring nominalized property talk into our language by trivial inferences from more congruent talk like the barn is red. And then you can see, oh, talk of these enters by a really different route than talk of barns and squirrels and trees does. It doesn't enter by trying to track some single spatiotemporal feature of our environment. And so we shouldn't expect that it have sort of a single spatiotemporal location. And so the worry about how could they be in two places at the same time is really kind of a leftover worry from thinking of them on the model of terms that refer to spatiotemporal particulars. Maybe we don't have to worry. So starting from examining the different functions and entry rules of the discourse for property talk enables us to diagnose and dissolve a lot of metaphysical problems. Grammatical metaphors, as Michael Halliday, the systemic functional linguistics guy I've been talking about, he interestingly notes that grammatical metaphors always bring the risk of puzzle and paradox. His example is a simple everyday one. You're writing a hiking history book of some, I don't know, ill-fated hike up Mount Everest, right? And you might want to order it by days. And you could say they got to the summit on the 5th day. Or to emphasize the order of days, you could say the 5th day saw them reach the summit, right? Perfectly fine grammatical transformation for rhetorical purposes, but then it looks paradoxical because days can't see, right? And of course, we get all kinds of other paradoxes with our philosophically familiar grammatical metaphors. And I've already pointed to how very many philosophically interesting terms are grammatical metaphors, so we should expect these kinds of puzzles, and seeing the difference in their entry rules might help us dissolve them and diagnose where the problems have come from. So a diagnosis of at least some of these problems is that putting them in language in this kind of noun form can lead us to implicitly expect that the introduced nouns function like congruent observationally acquired nouns do. Nouns like wolf and strawberry. That function to pick out and track entities we causally interact with, and that are defective if there's not such a causal connection, right? So the term Bigfoot is defective if it's just introduced in stories, if nobody has ever seen the giant fuzzy guy in the North Woods. Phlogiston, we know, is defective. But it's a mistake to apply this analogy over to terms that don't have those functions and rules of use. And then you end up with problems, right? Some of the vaunted philosophical problems, like there can't be universals because nothing can be in in two places at the same time. Or what about moral properties? If there were moral properties, they'd have to be queer action guiding things, but a mere thing in the world can't guide our action, right? So the problem goes, oh, maybe moral property language is derived from regulative language, and that's why it's action guiding, and it just introduces new textual functions. That modal properties would be unknowable because we can't come into causal contact with them. Again, if you don't think of your modal talk as tracking possible worlds or as tracking modal features of this world, but rather as doing something else, you may get a different route to modal knowledge, which I try to draw out in Chapter 7 of Norms and Necessity. And you can see other problems that seem to similarly arise from this kind of mistaken analogy with congruent observationally acquired language. Debunking arguments in epistemology that rely on the idea that our knowledge of morality or modality should come from causal interaction with the things. And so if you can't be causally connected to the moral or modal properties, you can't think you have knowledge. Eleatic arguments against the existence of things of various kinds. We mentioned Monday, I think it was, assume that we should only accept that our terms refer if they pick out something we can causally interact with. Causal theories of reference, right? Things like, oh, look, our terms couldn't even refer to fictional characters, other abstract numbers, abstract entities, seem to assume that all terms are introduced through ostension. If we get a different story, maybe we can avoid some of the problems. So, should we say there are properties? Right? This is just an example, right, of how the functional approach can enable you to make better informed and less arbitrary decisions. Well, it looks like we have prospect, at least. This is only a sketch, not a full version of the argument. That would take a paper on its own. A lot of the arguments against them can be debunked. Paradoxes and puzzles arise from false analogies. And the functions they serve are really useful, right, to things like theory construction. So it would be a mistake to eliminate the discourse. If you keep the discourse, you've got these trivial rules, the sort of easy ontological inferences that entitle you to say, sure, there are properties in the only sense that makes sense. And you can do something similar for numbers. But I don't mean to say that our functional analyses are always going to tell us, yeah, this is really useful, keep it. Right? It can go the other way, too. So let me give you an example of maybe how it can go another way. Again, without full detail, just pointing how it might go. Sometimes the functional analyses can give us reasons for revision. So think about our race and gender terms, right, which has been discussed a lot in the conceptual engineering literature recently. Again, start by attending to the functions served. These may not be innocuous. So these are generalized noun terms. We know about nominalizations and their roles they play in explanatory theories. And the role that nominalizations generally play in explanatory theories may encourage people to think of race and gender terms as playing an explanatory role, encouraging essentializing inferences. When in fact, they've been shown to be scientifically, the race terms especially, gender terms are a little more complicated, useless for making any kinds of very interesting generalized inference. So they sort of look as if they ought to be playing an explanatory theoretic role, something like maybe the concept of amphibian or something like that, turn out not to. So that's a problem, kind of like Bigfoot has a problem, right? But what other roles do these generalized terms play? Right? Well, interestingly, they also play a role prominently in bureaucracies, in imposing layers of norms, right? Structured layers of norms. And then you can look back at history, and I have a strong suspicion that we'd discover that what these terms have really done, base terms say, is embedding the individuals picked out into a web of social norms. How you're to act, how you are to be treated, what sorts of jobs you are to have, what rights you are to be given, what respect you are to be given, and so on. If we notice all that, if that's right, and this is all very brief and speculative, right, then we might have reason to revise these terms significantly. Get rid of them, revise them, do something. Right? It's not innocuous. So in short, right, we go about assessing how well the terms serve their purported functions, what functions they've actually been serving, whether those are functions we should preserve, and then accordingly we might have to reject or modify the discourse. So it can go either way. In any case, by bringing in a kind of functional approach to conceptual engineering, we can let our work be guided by attention to what functions our terms have served and what we want them to serve, and evaluating how well they do so. And we can get pragmatic criteria then for making these kinds of conceptual choices that doesn't make anything we do just arbitrary or ungrounded, nor does it need a kind of metaphysical basis. Might occasionally need empirical input, but not something distinctively metaphysical. And this, I would say, enables us to better then consider reasons for retaining, rejecting, or revising the terms. And that enables us to give conceptual engineering something like a kind of methodological transparency that's lacking in traditional metaphysics. Now, you'll have been listening carefully and notice that there's a deeper level of evaluation that I've left off the table so far, right? And that's this. Yeah, okay, we can find out what functions they have served. We can say what functions we want them to serve. But what functions really ought they to serve, right? And that, of course, is a deeply moral or ethical question of what purposes or functions we ought to adopt, right? I don't have an answer to that. Though I think a proper understanding of the functions of moral discourse may enable us to make progress on moral epistemology in ways parallel to ways I've tried to show how a proper understanding of the functions of modal discourse can enable us to make some progress on the problems of modal epistemology. But that's a story for another day. At least we can do this much. We can put on the table what are the functions, and then we can make them evaluable. In practice, I think there will often be broad agreement, once the functions are made clear, that some are helpful. Simplifying our statements of theories? Who could not like that, right? Good function of numbers, right? That others are insidious, imposing differential norms on people just because they look different, even when there's no grounds to infer anything else different about them, but we're going to treat them worse. Very few people would stand up and say, yes, that's a norm that we should keep. And in this way, I think, once we lay the functions on the table, we can at least make progress on a range of issues, concrete issues in conceptual engineering, even if there's other cases where it's really difficult to figure out what purposes we should adopt and how to weigh them up. At least we make things transparent and open to public debate. Okay, so where we've been. I argued that metaphysics has been misdirected by a functional monist assumption, at least in two prominent forms that we've seen in the last 50 years, the explanatory conception and the truth-maker conception, and even the general idea that metaphysics investigates the world and what it's like seems to rely on a kind of view that takes metaphysics to be engaged in describing the world and what it's like. That these approaches to metaphysics have led to irrelevant debates, say about which entities have and don't have explanatory powers or are the real truth makers, to pseudo-problems and puzzles, to epistemological mysteries, and to a rivalry with science. If we rethink metaphysics instead as conceptual engineering, I've argued, we can preserve a whole lot of what metaphysics has always done well. We don't have to throw away all our old anthologies. The works of Hume and Locke and the like are as relevant as ever. Right? But we can be more upfront about what's going on there. We can avoid a rivalry with science and make proliferation of views non-problematic. And taken in a functional direction, we can provide a kind of methodological clarity and avoid epistemological mystery. So we don't need epistemically metaphysical work, just descriptive and normative conceptual work and empirical work that's valuable in non-arbitrary ways by appeal to functions. Rethinking metaphysics as conceptual engineering still gives us plenty of work to do in trying to understand our conceptual scheme, to reconcile the scientific and ordinary conceptual scheme, to evaluate our conceptual schemes, and to renew it, including in situations of new technology or new social settings. And so it doesn't make metaphysics shallow or uninteresting at all. On the contrary, it gives us a way to show its importance to human life in ways that even the natural sciences don't directly meet. And so there's plenty of useful work to do in disentangling puzzlements, understanding how our linguistic scheme works, investigating how to reconcile parts, and determining what to do with it. Another feature of this model that I like, I don't know if you will, is that on this model, metaphysics becomes a kind of permanently difficult and permanently unfinished task. It's not like we could just discover the fundamental truths of the universe and write them in Aristotle's books and be done with it, right? If part of what we're doing is figuring out what concepts we should use and how we should use them, that's always which concepts should we use now, given our current knowledge, social and technological situation, history, etc. And that's always going to be an enduring problem as our knowledge changes, our setting changes, our technology changes, our environment and our social reality changes. Now you might ask, this is just a coda kind of question. Okay, so you're arguing for reconceiving metaphysics in this way. Should we still call it metaphysics? Or just drop the word metaphysics, let that go back to being a pejorative as it was with the positivists, and do conceptual engineering instead? I'm still thinking about this, so I'm interested in hearing your views. I'm inclined to keep it. And yes, you can think of this itself as a project in conceptually engineering the concept of metaphysics, right? What's the basis for keeping it? Well, we'll abandon some of the pretensions of metaphysics to be the master science or to tell us what the world is like or what's fundamental. But we can keep continuity with what's been done before, highlight a distinct kind of work that can be done and that often has been done and that's really useful to human existence. Oh, there we go. We can retain its enduring importance to human life because we'll always need to reevaluate and rethink the language and concepts we use to navigate, investigate, and shape our world. Whatever we call it, this is important, tractable, and philosophical work that remains to be done, because how we think and talk really matters. That's it.
Thank you, Amie. Now time for questions. Erik Olsson.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful, amazing talk. And it's, as we have been talking before, and what you're doing here is extremely close to what I'm doing in epistemology, so I'm very happy to...
The allies.
So yeah, we are allies. But there's one difference. So I'm a more kind of an orthodox Carnapian, and you differ from Carnap's account in several ways, I think. So one, I mean, Carnap starts with what he calls the elucidation of the explicandum. So he starts with looking at different uses of terms, and that's in contrast to your functional starting point. So you are concerned with functions somehow initially, and then I noticed that while you mentioned the fruitfulness aspect of certain, I mean, terms, in like fish, for instance, in much the same way as Carnap does, and you even take his example of fish.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned simplicity as a concern or something that you would like to adhere to, but you didn't mention exactness. And you didn't mention similarity to the explicandum, two of the other requirements or desiderata mentioned by Carnap. So is that a deep? Are these differences kind of deep differences, or are they superficial differences? So that's one thought I had. Another thought, while I have the microphone, is the following, and it's a kind of advocate of the devil question. So I mean, so someone could say that, or someone could think that. Do we need philosophers to do this engineering work, or why not do that within science itself? Yeah. So I mean, and Carnap, he was inspired by the way scientists are engineering their concepts, like in the case of fish, for instance. So what is the special competence then of philosophers that enable us to do more useful work than the scientists themselves would do. So that's one part of the thing. And but the other part is that some of the examples you give of a more kind of non-scientific or non-scientific concepts like perhaps race and gender, they seem to me to perhaps become more political projects, and then the issue is raised by the philosophers to do that kind of work, or should perhaps politicians be those who are doing that kind of conceptual work? So it's a lot of things.
Yeah,
but
good. Great questions. Okay. Yeah. So let me start at the beginning. I like to think these are fairly superficial differences between me and Carnap, just based on what sorts of cases we have in view, roughly. So, as we all know, Carnap is primarily interested in explication of terms for use in the sciences. For that, absolutely, exactness is super relevant for exactly the reasons he brings out. It's not clear that exactness is always relevant for whatever concept we're using, right? For some social concepts, if you make it too very precise down to the minute of when someone becomes an adult, for example, and all their rights and obligations change, this has a tendency to feel arbitrary, for example, right? So for some of our concepts, keeping them vague, general, easy to apply, not too exact, might be a virtue, at least. We don't have, if we even think it might be, then we want to put that as a totally general criterion, though it's one totally relevant for the cases Carnap has in mind. Similarity, Carnap's a little more dithery about that himself, I think. He's like, other things being equal, that's kind of nice. And I think we can preserve that there's always a cost in the change of our conceptual scheme, a learning curve, if nothing else, right? So it's not the be-all and end-all. Sometimes we do have to just change over our concepts. So I don't think we differ totally there. The elucidation stuff, as far as I recall from the bits of Carnap I know, and tell me if you know bits that I don't, he doesn't say very much about how elucidation's to go. Yeah. Looking at prior uses will be one part of probably the analytical stage of it that I talked about. And then I do want to add this explicit appeal to functions, which I think is kind of, I hope, you tell me, in the spirit of Carnap, of the kind of pragmatic spirit of tolerance, right, and choice of linguistic frameworks for different purposes. So it might be kind of a way of bringing that to the surface. Let me take the second question. Do we need philosophy, or should the scientists just do it? So for these scientific concepts like species, space-time, etc., you got to at least know the science well to do it well if you're really engineering these concepts for use in the sciences. And I think it's interesting that a lot of these are cases where philosophy of X science, of biology, or of physics, or whatever, comes into play, and where the philosophers kind of work hand in hand with the scientists in figuring out what concept of species we should use, for example. Why might philosophers be any use here, not just leave it to the scientists? Well, on the one hand, we are pretty well trained, I think, in these kinds of conceptual issues and conceptual work and thinking about the inferential relations. That might be helpful. Normative issues, we get training in a way that scientists probably don't. Also, I think philosophers may be particularly helpful in trying to figure out these kinds of reconciliation issues, right, of how the now concept of space-time in physics is related to our phenomenological concept of time, or our sort of everyday clock concept of time. And for that, any of that kind of reconciliation work, of figuring out how these new scientific concepts relate to our old scheme, then somebody who has both in view is going to be useful. But I certainly don't mean to say only philosophers get to do conceptual engineering. It's done all over the place, and it's often done very well. It can be done well by scientists or lawyers or politicians, maybe, also. So I mean really to highlight it as a distinct kind of work that metaphysics has often done and can do, rather than this is our turf, right, and nobody else gets to come there. Which brings to the last one, right, are these really political projects. And in some cases, certainly the implementation is, right? That is to say, trying to make it the case that now the government works with 3 gender concepts and not just 2, for example, or that we've redefined marriage, or introduced a legal concept of sexual harassment. I want to separate out the sort of normative analysis. Should we have such a concept, or what gender concepts should we have? What should it be? What should they be like, right? From the implementation project. And there too, I don't know, maybe probably your politicians are much better than ours. But as an American, I would really hesitate to leave, no, not so much, just some head shaking. I would hesitate to leave it all to the politicians. And even among the activists who are often, you know, up to good stuff, but you often just see this sort of push for use of one concept rather than another, and accusation that anyone who doesn't use it that way is sort of immoral or old-fashioned or behind, rather than putting the reasons on the table and having a real public discussion. So at the phase of figuring out what concepts ought we to use and why, I would love to see at least philosophical thinking explicitly involved and a public examination of reasons, rather than just leaving it, even though obviously somebody else will have to be involved in making it the case in the law. But yeah. At least in the US, a lot of our lawyers are trained in philosophy. Or maybe I should say a lot of our philosophy majors go into law, but it's probably the other direction. But hopefully that can be some use. So some thoughts of that. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Tony.
Thank you very much, Amy. It was a really interesting talk. I have a question. I suppose it's a question of clarification, no? So I was very happy to see that you quoted in your discussion of Hawking's dismissal of philosophy, that there are other ways of understanding philosophy, no? And one would be to enter into what we would call practical philosophy,
yes.
Value theory, and so on, no? So, and then when you were motivating your views on taking your approach to metaphysics, you were doing it in terms of need, in terms of evaluative language, no?
Yeah.
So I took in one way. So my first invitation on what was going on here was that here's someone that respects the division between fact and value, no? Which suggests that you are not a naturalist in terms of how to interpret these notions. No, you could be a naturalist in the sense of being, let's say, an expressivist or a prescriptivist or something like that, but a pure naturalist, someone thinking that we can understand a well-function translated into a purely descriptive language, that wouldn't work. But if that's the case, I'm not quite sure how you will avoid the arbitrary condition. Objection, though. Yeah. Because this is the objection that's been hanging over naturalists and even in fact expressivists and prescriptivists now. So and I'm actually rather much in favor of many of these non-cognitivist views on how to interpret evaluative language, you know. But in a sense, the way you forward your view here, you're making it dependent on evaluative language that you're leaving a bit unanalyzed now. So I guess my question for clarification is, how much of a naturalist are you when it comes to words like well, need, and other evaluative importance that you were using here in order to sort of forward your metaphysics here?
Yeah, and how are you understanding naturalism in that question? I want to make sure I...
Reducible to a statement in natural terms or in purely descriptive terms,
yeah.
non-evaluative terms.
Yeah, then I'm not.
You're not.
Yeah. So, but let me try to answer this.
Then you are open to the question, so how should we understand these notions though?
Right.
Because one way would be to go non-naturalist, a la Moore, no? Another way would be to be completely intuitionist or prescriptivist and so on, no?
Right.
But all of these positions, with the exception of Moore's and so, are really open to a kind of objection of arbitrariness now, because there's no way we can finally justify our evaluations now. We can only allude to our desires and so on now. So are you making your metaphysics depending on our desires?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, at a sort of a bad side effect of this approach to metaphysics is it backs me into having to do meta-ethics, which, yeah, sort of beyond my... and I'll have to learn. Okay, so I'll give you a short, shallow answer, and then I'll give you a maybe slightly better point, or pointed towards a slightly better answer. Short, shallow answer is, at least to the extent that we can interpret these as hypothetical imperatives, if you want to promote racial justice, then adopt Sally Haslinger's concepts. If you want to simplify your theories, don't get rid of number terms, right? So those hypothetical imperatives we could adopt. We can give probably even empirical reason for thinking that this is a good route to take. And I think a lot of the debates in conceptual engineering can really be seen as hypothetical imperatives, where there's a kind of implicit agreement that, of course, we want theoretical terms that will aid our scientific theories and enable generalization and prediction, right? It's kind of Sider's presupposition. Of course, Sally Haslinger's talking to people who, of course, will want to promote racial and gender justice, doesn't feel she has to adopt that. That's the shallow answer, right? That'll cover a lot and make it non-arbitrary if you presuppose a need. But then there's these deep questions I had that one slide on, right? All right, so what do we do about those? Which will resolve in the question of what functions and purposes are we to pursue, and so on, right? All right, it won't surprise you to know that I would like to start on that work by asking questions about the functions of moral discourse, right? Now, I don't really do metaethics yet. I'm just starting, and I got one paper that's co-authored that I'm working on this, but roughly, okay, so I've done this stuff on modality, and modality and morality often run into parallel issues, right? I tend to think of our moral language as originating with, say, deontic modals. Maybe commands first, sort of hairstyle, but then you can transform these don't kill into a deontic modal, you mustn't kill, right? That introduces new functions, like you can put in grades of obligation and so on. Then you can get derivations from those. Now that already makes a move of removing the speaker, right? So it no longer looks like me commanding you. I'm just saying there's this rule, right? We can move explicitly to speak about moral rules. All right, now what's the function of particularly moral rules instead of other kinds of deontic modals? Well, you might think, again, I don't have a worked out view on this, but you might think it involves something like, I think this is Joyce's view, solving coordination problems, enabling us to all live together, right? Resolving differences about how we ought to live. And then you might think that puts constraints, at least, on what should go into the content of you must, should, oughtn't as a moral term, or the following, these are the following moral rules, right? So that any that aren't going to promote this end, if we have the right analysis of the function of moral language, can be ruled out. Now, and I don't know exactly how to do this. This is sort of like a pointer towards a big project that I'm sure you know more about how these things would go than I do. I don't have any illusions that this will always give us the answer to what ought I to do now. There will always be some open-endedness and arbitrariness. There may be some answers that are better than others, like the bridges. Yeah. Oh, it's just like, no, you can go on. Evaluating moral language, you mean? Or?
The reasons that you're providing now.
Yeah.
These are actually supposed to happen during your evaluative discourse, no? So you are trying to convince me evaluatively that there are these functions, no, and so on, no, and I'm fine with that, no, because this is not the sort of so we could evaluatively disagree about this.
So, I mean, I think of it there as being, as I put it in the earlier slides, sort of two phases, right? There's a kind of descriptive reverse engineering work. And I think in the reverse engineering phase, you might be able to get a view of what moral discourse is for and what role moral terms play in language. And then we can at least say, here are some directions in which that would not be a properly moral claim, that wouldn't even count as a moral claim, and this would, right? That may at least enable us to make some distinctions, yeah, in ways it doesn't mean that every moral claim is arbitrary, that we may end up with indeterminacies, yeah.
May I just make a small question? So
yeah.
When you said that that on your approach then there would not be any rivalry with science, no? But isn't this actually a point of rivalry? Because would science actually recognize that there is this evaluative aspect to our approach to life, or what they? I'm not so sure that they would.
I think that, because there's two ways you can interpret that, right? You could either say science just isn't looking at that. They're not making a claim that there is or there isn't. That's just what I would tend to say.
And then I would say that they are wrong.
Well, it depends on if they purport to be complete, right? And this is part of my response to Sellers, too. Right? It's not clear to me that scientists as such purport to give us a complete view of the world. And if we have a division between the normative and the descriptive, and we can just see the scientists as focusing on these descriptive questions, right? Then in doing the normative work, we don't have to see this as a rivalry with anything the scientists are committed to in virtue of their scientific work. So I'd say that they leave it out, not that they're committed to it not existing. But
Okay, and then we have Paul Russell. Give you the mic.
Exercise. Thank you. Thanks again for another really interesting talk, and I've got again tons of questions, and I'm a little bit trying to focus my question, but it's a bit about the what you're committed to with this kind of functional pluralist view, and I'm thinking here of Strawson's distinction. It's the really two distinctions I'm interested in that seem to overlap, and I'm interested in how they relate to your functional pluralist view. One is Strawson's distinction between descriptive and revisionary metaphysics.
yeah, right.
So I was wondering, just as you were going on, I wasn't quite sure which side of that fence you wanted to fall on, and one thought that I had was that you might be a skeptic about the distinction itself.
Oh.
And the other kind of distinction related to that is, you know, Strawson's got this idea that he thinks he's looking for concepts that are so fundamental that I think, as he puts it in some contexts, they have no real history. They're just universal to us. Whereas a lot of the concepts you're talking about are ones that do have a history.
Yes.
They are cultural, and so they're ones that we have some choice about.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a set of overlapping, quite important issues here about choice, culture, what's universal, what's contingent.
Totally.
So you might see your framework as being skeptical, and I'm wondering about this. I'm interested to know what you say about the descriptive revisionary distinction itself, and related to that about the idea of whether there is any such thing as this fundamental basic versus cultural conceptual distinction, or whether you want to just kind of collapse both of those distinctions.
Yeah. Okay, great questions. And thanks for bringing Strawson in. That's something I should really connect to this in writing about this topic. So on the first question, descriptive versus revisionary metaphysics, I really want to fall on both sides of that fence. I want to allow for both kinds of work. Just a little autobiography here. I think in my earlier work, I really saw myself as just doing descriptive metaphysics, as Strawson put. I think even referred to him occasionally on that basis. And I still think a lot of the revisionary proposals of metaphysicians should be rejected, let's say. There are no tables, for example, so it's stuff I sort of, cut my metaphysical teeth on, really arguing against. But I've become increasingly sympathetic to the idea that we can do more than just explicate our conceptual scheme and how it works, that we can also work to change it, or at least parts of it, pointing to your second half of your question, right? And this was probably in part through Sally Haslinger's work, too, that sort of first attuned me to that idea. Oh, yeah, obviously, that's right, that's good. We can work to change it. So I want to allow room for both and have a kind of big tent, so to speak, that I'll reinterpret both as conceptual work, which I guess Strawson kind of did anyway. Now, are there some universal basic concepts? Yeah, okay, right. So the whole idea of conceptual engineering relies on the idea that at least many of our concepts are historical, can change, are human inventions for human purposes, and so on. I'm actually totally open to the idea that there's at least a few that are really basic and built in for all of us. I kind of think of that as an empirical issue. So, I'm really persuaded so far. This is, developmental cognitive psychology is a little beyond my area of expertise, but I love Susan Carey's work on this, right? So as you probably know, but not everybody in the room does, she has this sort of nice arguments that there's, about 5 concepts that she thinks are evolutionarily basic and that we share with pre-linguistic infants and with rhesus macaques and some other creatures that share really way back evolutionary ancestors with us, but not very close. Concepts like object in the Spelke object sense, which I mentioned the other day, medium-sized trackable thing, agent, number, I forget what the others are. So, I'm actually totally open to the idea that there's at least a few that are, you could go either way, right? You could go empirical psychology, or you could go Kantian transcendental, and or Strawsonian in a way, right? And have an argument that these are concepts without which one could not experience a world at all, act at all, whatever. I'm open to both those kinds of arguments. I think it'll probably be just a few, just a handful, if at all. I know those are controversial too. But so far from what I've read, it looks like at least on the empirical side, there's pretty good grounds for thinking. There's a few built-in concepts for us, but then we get a whole lot more when we get language, and we can sort of leverage that into making the full range of conceptual distinctions we know. Now, if that's right, then conceptual engineering will have some limits, right? At least in the sense of thinking of it as changing things the reverse engineering will still be part of what tells us, hang on, there are some conceptual fixed points here that we can't change, but we won't be able to do anything very constructive with removing those or changing them, probably. Yeah, yeah, good question.
Thanks. I have a question over here.
I write a little bit about Carrie in, I think it's chapter 5, one of the chapters of Norms and Necessity. I sort of discuss her work a little bit and its relevance to that. Yeah, you can find it in the index.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm very sympathetic with your really illuminating language and so on. It's very cool. But I'm wondering a bit about if we subscribe to functional pluralism in metaphysics, if it could be counterintuitive, or not counterintuitive, but counterproductive in some cases, where if we think about the cooperation between metaphysics and science, and where scientific theories lead us to some very counterintuitive ideas, where the functions that we might prioritize, they might not be good enough, or they might not coincide well with the functions that we should actually prioritize in that case, because those ideas are so counterintuitive. And I just want to know what you think about that.
Do you have an example in mind?
Yeah, for example, with the special relativity that you brought up. So Einstein, he challenged the idea of absolute simultaneity, right? And that's for most people, if we just go back in history, that's a very counterintuitive idea.
Yeah. Sure.
And how would we find functions for those kinds of things, in the moment? I feel like metaphysics should provide, maybe without the normative side, different kinds of theories, so that scientists, it's like with math, right? You have a lot of mathematical projects that seem kind of redundant, but then we find use for them in physics. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'm after, I think.
Yeah, good. So my initial reaction is that, a lot of these terms that get introduced, say, in physics, as they start to have a new use of space and time as space-time or simultaneity, are really being adapted to a new set of functions that involves especially prediction and explanation in very precise contexts of investigations of physics. Right? And in some ways, this is my suspicion, I haven't done the hard work, and I turn to the philosophers of physics to really do this work. In some ways, I think it might be best to explicitly separate those from our ordinary concepts, right? It's maybe a ladder you use in order to kind of understand the physics, and then you got to kick it away and just do the predictive work. And it might have entirely different functions than the everyday concept of simultaneously. If I want to meet you at the same time in front of the cafe so we can have lunch together, right? Which requires nothing like the kind of simultaneity that gets rejected, right, for special relativity. So my inclination is to think that we can, in some ways, remove some of the counterintuitiveness if we see that these are really new terms, almost homophones with our old terms, right? They sound like them, but they've got new functions, they've got new rules of use, and so on, right? And then we can still investigate what, if anything, is the relation between them, and maybe we want to keep them both for different ranges of purposes. So, yeah, I guess that's a sort of short story. I would kind of hope that we can remove some of the feeling of counterintuitiveness and certainly remove some of the confusions by more clearly separating the roots of these two different terms that sound alike and maybe have a common origin, but really end up with very different functions. I mean, I'd love to do some stepping stuff on solidity on that too, to choose a more tractable example, right? So, in daily life, what do we want a concept of solidity for? Not in order to say there is zero space between the molecules composing this, but in order to say, you can sit on it without falling through, right? Water won't pour through it, and that's all totally fine. So that's kind of my inclination, but I think they have to be looked at kind of case by case, and preferably by philosophers of physics.
Okay, Ingmar, and then Niklas.
Well, first, Thank you for 3 very nice and very stimulating lectures. I will, in my comment now, more or less make the same point that I made yesterday. I agree with very much, but. And yesterday I agree with everything you said about multifunctionality of language, and then I accused you of now and then forgetting the descriptive use of language. And this comes back today in a way that now you require that, let's speak of ontology, not the whole of metaphysics, that it should not be in rivalry with science. And I ask, why not? Well, one answer should be because science is descriptive, part of it. Forget when they do explanation, just when they put forward taxonomies and relating and describe things. And I think that there should be an overlap between ontology and science. And I think that that's the way it has functioned in the history. So I noted that you said that there has been in metaphysics metalinguistic negotiation. I would say if you look at the philosophers around the scientific revolution, what really made them think was that the old Aristotelian framework collided with the new theories in physics, and that they had to do something. Well, you can say it was a matter of conceptual engineering. Yes, true. But it was a conceptual engineering concerned with the description. They needed the philosopher to create a new ontology in order to make sense of the new physics. And since you're not, and you, Robin want me to be short, I'll stop there. But thank you for the stimulating lectures.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just say something about how I see the relationship between ontology and science there. Or maybe I should put it in slightly different terms. I think, and this is sort of a Carnapian side of me again, I want to distinguish between the work that needs to be done in figuring out what set of concepts to use versus the truths that may be stated using those concepts, right, once you've got the linguistic or conceptual framework in place. I don't really think of it as which conceptual scheme should we choose. An answer to that is being true or false. It can be a good or bad idea given our goals, right? And if our goal is to be able to make biological generalizations or make causal explanations, if you go back to Newtonian physics as opposed to the Aristotelian or something like that, then it may be that there's a fact of the matter about adopting this conceptual scheme is going to enable us to do better, to make more generalizations about fish, right? Or to make better sense of the universe in ways that enables us to state certain kinds of generalizable causal laws, right? So I think there are factual questions about how well a conceptual scheme will enable you to do science. There's factual questions that can be asked using a conceptual scheme once you've adopted it, but the question which conceptual scheme should we adopt, I think of as a separate kind of normative question. And so this is where I part company from people like Ted Sider, who think that the goal of our conceptual scheme is to track a kind of metaphysical structure of the world. And I think we can recapture some of that desire in terms of facts of the matter about which conceptual scheme will best enable us to make generalizations, to formulate laws, to do physics or biology or whatever it is. So that's how I'd want to kind of respect the intuition behind it without going all the way down the street that you want to go, I think.
Niklas Dahl.
Thank you. And I, of course, continue to agree with you through most of these lectures. But I have a question about whether or not you think there are different pragmatic criteria for evaluating conceptual schemes in different areas. Because clearly there can be different functions to, say, epistemic vocabulary, physical vocabulary, or political vocabulary.
Yeah.
But let's just take three terms, for example. Would you say that when we evaluate the use of the term truth, the use of the term mass in physics, or the use of the term gender, that we have different pragmatic evaluatory norms, or are they basically the same kind of norms, the same kind of project?
Yeah, I'd say they're different. I mean, you can get a sort of formal similarity. They're all evaluated according to how well they fulfill their functions, or perhaps the functions we want them to have, right? But the functions are so very different. If you think perhaps the function of truth is roughly textual, either as a device of generalization or as putting pressure for reconciliation, as Hugh Price has it, or maybe both or some other element in there too. Those would be the functions for a concept of truth. Functions for a concept of mass, presumably it's to enable us to make all sorts of calculations and formulate general laws in physics. This is why we need the difference between a mass concept and a weight concept too, because it's going to figure more usefully in our laws. Gender concepts are trickier, right? The question is whether we'd have them at all. You know, as I know the history, and maybe some of you know it better, the very idea of gender as opposed to biological sex was introduced by Simone de Beauvoir as a way of trying to distinguish all of the sort of cultural norms behind the way in which women versus men typically act from anything that's really basic and biological. Now we might want that for either originally purposes of imposing these norms and getting girls to act like girls and boys to act like boys, or for debunking them, right, by separating that off from biological sex as de Beauvoir does. And nowadays, people seem to want them in order to be able to sort of identify with some set of norms that they internally feel they want to identify with and how they want to be treated. So yeah, very, very different kinds of functions. And in each of those cases, I think that means the criteria of evaluation, what the hell should we do with this concept? Is it functioning well, etc., will vary. I mean, there'll be some problems that might arise for any concept whatsoever. You know, if any concept gets us into contradiction, we should think about that at least. I'm not saying we should automatically throw it out, right? And I don't think it's as widespread as Kevin Sharp thinks, these kind of inconsistencies. But beyond that, I think it's going to be very case by case. You have a follow-up.
It's a very short follow-up. It's just, but you would still say that the conditions for evaluation are pragmatic in all cases.
I would say they're pragmatic in all cases, yes. But measuring to different pragmatic needs. Just like our criteria for evaluating, you know, a steak knife, a can opener, a crane, right, are all going to vary according to what these things are supposed to do.
How well they fulfill their function.
Right, for their function to be so different that you'll look for a very different thing in a steak knife versus in a crane. Yeah.
Could the title of your lectures been redirecting ontology rather than metaphysics? Because, or put it, how do you see the relationship between those two concepts?
Yeah, okay, good question. So the way I use them, and you know, like many other concepts, these are a bit up for grabs in negotiation. I see ontology as concerned with existence questions. Right? This is roughly, I mean, I used to see it really differently when I read Ingarden and Husserl and stuff, but it got taken over by all the Neo-Aquinians who use it relentlessly to mean a view about what there is or what exists. So I've fallen in step with that usage. So the reason I don't say rethinking ontology here is because I think there's some questions of metaphysics that aren't just existence questions. These include prominently modal questions about identity and persistence conditions, for example. They probably include other questions too. If you believe in grounding, they'll include grounding questions or fundamentality questions, right? So there's other things that people count as metaphysics apart from the existence questions that most people will locate with ontology. So you can kind of see my past work. I was always kind of up to trying to rethink metaphysics, well, over the last 15 years or so. And I thought of it this way. Here's two big clumps of metaphysics: existence questions and modal questions. I don't say that's all there is, but there's big clumps at least. So ontology made easy deals with the existence questions. Norms and necessity deals with the modal questions, tries to deflate both of them, and then the lectures you've seen this week will be the basis for a sort of third book in the series saying, how should we reconceive metaphysics? Which will include both existence questions and modal questions, and then we can think about the rest. But that's why I chose those words.
Okay, Victoria Hög.
Thank you. Thank you for a very rich talk. I'm an historian of ideas, intellectual historian, so I will have a more general question. When you you opened up your new directions in metaphysics, here you came up with, for example, what you said, importance in reshaping the social world.
Yeah.
And social concept also impose norms, and I completely agree with that. That's a really important task. But can you give any examples of some metaphysicians or philosophers doing this? For people you are mentioned, de Beauvoir, Foucault, yes, they are not counted as proper philosophers. We do have, in the US, you have concerned scientists that really try to open up a link to societal questions, but we don't have concerned metaphysicians or concerned philosophers. But could you give an example of a way of doing this that you have experience of?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to re-engineer these social concepts. Yeah, I think the main exemplar these days is Sally Haslinger, really. Started this line of work with her paper, Race and Gender, What Are They? What Do We Want Them to Be? And explicitly opened up this redefinition of race and gender, which is explicitly not what people have in mind or anything like that, right, as a way of trying to achieve social justice. Right? And then she really kicked off a big movement. There have been lots of people who've criticized her view of gender concepts, say, as not including trans people and so on, and try to re-engineer it in other ways, right? So that's been sort of the start of the movement. Appia, too, Anthony Appia, you can see his work on race, which he didn't used to really present in terms of conceptual engineering, and now he does, right? It's like, here are ways in which our old race terms and the uses of race terms as if they're scientific in Jefferson and Arnold's work failed. What should we do with them? Should we use a kind of concept of racial identity? Should we get rid of them? Right? Again, with kind of these social goals in mind. So I think that's where it's been most prominent. There's some other work going on too. There was an online conference in the Netherlands a few weeks ago on like applied conceptual engineering given technology. Somebody else at this? Yeah. So they dealt with questions about like privacy is where I got that example from, right? And what should we do with that in a way that's really going to shape our technological and legal practices going forward. So I think so-called analytic philosophers, or at least let me say American and philosophers that I know, are giving some increasing attention to this in ways that would have been really unthinkable when I was in graduate school, right? So it's kind of interesting. It's a kind of interesting new turn that it's taken, which I think also brings the work of intellectual history much greater into relevance than most analytic philosophers would have given it credit for. So there's also some really interesting work I've just been teaching last week on conceptual genealogy, right? And tying that kind of work and its relevance to these positive engineering projects into work in intellectual history and reclaiming people like Foucault and bringing it back into the fold. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Is that what sort of thing you had in mind? Yeah, cool.
Okay, we have time for one more question, a short one.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's that short, so, but I try to state it. And so, first, thanks all for these 3 very interesting lectures. Been very nice to hear them. I wonder whether you could say more about the function of the notion of truth, since that's such a... I mean, we have plenty, not that much time left.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a central notion in metaphysics, of course. And your view of that function, and perhaps I could clarify why you reject the truth maker conception. I mean, you're endorsed in pragmatic notion, I guess. So, but some more words about that would be really nice to hear.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure. And it's nothing I've written about and worked out all the details on. This is not a concept I've done my own work on, but I am positively inclined to. It seems like a really prime target for the kind of functional analysis I'm talking about. And if I was to do it, or if I was to say something, say in response to a question at a talk, right, I would point towards, you know, I'm very favorably inclined to like Paul Horwich's work that treats truth as serving what I would now call a textual function as a device of generalization, enables us to form generalizations we couldn't otherwise. I'm also, and I think they're compatible, favorably inclined towards Hugh Price's proposal in Truth as Convenient Friction, right? That the concept of truth also doesn't just enable us to form these generalizations, but puts a kind of pressure on us to reconcile our differences and come up with a single answer. I think that's really useful. I'm not sure if that's all that should be said, but all these sort of views about the function of the concept of truth would be very much things I find amenable anyway, and that don't require us to think of truth in like heavy-duty correspondence or truth-making terms. Good question.
Okay, thank you, Amie. That was the last question. I'm going to give the mic to our head of department, Martin Jönsson, who I think is going to give you a token of our appreciation.
I will. Thanks so much for 3 wonderfully clear lectures. Very interesting. And thank you also for your kind advice of how to do metaphysics better. So before you leave, I'd like to extend the Pufendorf medal to you as a token of our appreciation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. Ooh, cool. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to have been your selection for this year, and it's been wonderful getting to talk with you all about philosophy over the last 3 days. So thanks for all the great input and discussion, and for being here and for having me here.